Vitamins and minerals, calcium. Calcium is a mineral that we will be discussing as part of the section on nutrients affecting bone health. We see various sources of calcium, with the most common and significant sources including dairy, seafood with bones such as sardines and anchovies, tofu, dark leafy greens such as spinach, and foods fortified with calcium. So dairy sources would include milk, yogurt, and cheese, and then common fortified foods would be soy milk or almond milk that would be fortified with calcium, juices fortified with calcium, and other food products. Talk about the digestion. So calcium is present in food as relatively insoluble salts, however, can be solubilized in the gastric juice of our stomach, since it's very acidic. So with the HCl, can solubilize the calcium salts, and with that it allows the calcium to be free and able to be absorbed through the enterocyte. With this solubilization process, the calcium may then be exposed and vulnerable to binding to other compounds. We see various compounds including types of fiber, oxalic acid, phytic acid. Those are some examples of some components that would bind to calcium, potentially limiting their bioavailability. A significant binder as it relates to calcium would be oxalic acid. That is a component of spinach. So spinach actually will contain significant amount of calcium, or it's a fairly significant plant-based source of calcium. However, it also contains oxalates, or also called oxalic acid, and so those oxalates in spinach will bind to the calcium, potentially limiting its absorption. So there are two mechanisms of the absorption of calcium. The first and primary mechanism of absorption is an active transport process. It's carrier mediated and it's saturable, which means that we can only handle a certain quantity of calcium intake at a time. So on average, it's typically reported about 500 milligrams of calcium at one time is the recommended amount, so to not exceed an intake of about 500 milligrams of calcium at once, and the remaining calcium intake should be consumed through various periods throughout the day. The RDA for calcium we'll see is 1,000 milligrams per day, so we again don't want to consume the whole RDA at one time. Calcium is absorbed in the duodenum and proximal jejunum, and again, since it's an active transport process, it requires energy. We see these three proteins that are involved with the process of calcium absorption. So we'll see what's called this TRPV6 channel, also calbindin, or calcium binding protein, CBP. So you can see that's either called calbindin or CBP for calcium binding protein, and then this calcium ATPase. The process of calcium absorption is stimulated by calcitriol. Calcitriol is active vitamin D, and so this is something that is fairly common knowledge, is that vitamin D helps to increase the process of calcium absorption, so it enhances calcium absorption. And when we talk about vitamin D, we'll see the mechanism for how vitamin D increases calcium absorption. But we do see that it's stimulated by this calcitriol, also by the hormone PTH, parathyroid hormone, and a diet low in calcium, so an intake of less than 400 milligrams per day approximately of calcium would actually increase the absorption process. So the percent of what is absorbed actually will increase when the intake of calcium is low. There's also a second mechanism. It's called paracellular diffusion, and this is a unique mechanism of absorption that we see with calcium. This paracellular diffusion process is actually a process of absorption between enterocytes. So there are these gaps between the enterocyte cells, so the intestinal cells, and so with high intakes, and this is not the primary mechanism, but it's a secondary mechanism where we can see some calcium being absorbed in a paracellular manner, so between the cells, and that is a passive diffusion process requiring no carriers. So the average percent of absorption, so the percent of calcium that is absorbed compared to what is consumed, is about 30%. So it's actually a fairly low percent absorption. However, the percent that is absorbed will increase during different life stages. So when needs are higher, particularly during pregnancy and lactation, or in the growing infant or child, and also during adolescence when gaining significant bone mass, the percent of absorption can increase up to about 75%. This diagram reviews both you can see the digestion, the absorption, and then the entry of calcium into circulation. So we'll discuss this process, and we're going to see both the carrier mediated process, and then you can see also the secondary mechanism of absorption being the paracellular mode. So we see the calcium salts here being available for the process of absorption. We did discuss that the calcium salts, when exposed, may also bind to compounds that may limit its bioavailability, such as phytates, oxalates, fatty acids, and fibers. So when bound to these compounds, then it's actually not going to be available for absorption and will be excreted in feces. But those that are not bound are available for the process of absorption. And so in this carrier-mediated mode of absorption, we see the carriers or the channels that is used for the calcium to enter the enterocyte through the brush border membrane. So this cylindrical structure is the TRPV6 channel. So again, TRPV6 channel, it's on the other slide, the previous slide that we reviewed. So first we have this channel, and then we have this protein here that looks kind of like a little head with a mouth almost here, right? This binding site available to bind to calcium. This is calbindin. So this is calcium binding protein, also called calbindin. So once calcium enters through the TRPV6 channel, then it's available to bind to calbindin. Calbindin acts as a shuttle, actually transporting the calcium from the brush border membrane through into the enterocyte, and then from the brush border to the basolateral membrane. So we see this calbindin binding calcium, shuttling it to the other side of the cell. It then releases the calcium, and then the calcium interacts with the calcium ATPase, and then at that point the calcium is able to move from the enterocyte through the basolateral membrane into circulation. We also see some additional ion transport, so we see magnesium also entering through this ATPase, and then calcium being shuttled out. So this will again be the primary mechanism of calcium absorption with the TRPV6 channel, the calbindin, moving calcium from the brush border membrane to the basolateral membrane, and then moving the calcium out through the basolateral membrane and into circulation. We again see the secondary mechanism of absorption between the enterocytes, so this paracellular mode of absorption. And then once in the bloodstream, we see the three different forms that calcium circulates in the blood. So most is actually going to be circulating free or bound to a protein, so primarily albumin. So we see mostly calcium being circulating free or bound to albumin. However, some is going to be bound to the citrate, sulfate, phosphate as well. But most, again, is going to be circulating free or bound to albumin. We see factors here either increasing or decreasing absorption of calcium. For the purposes of this class, we're going to be focusing primarily on vitamin D, actually increasing absorption of calcium as we mentioned before, and then factors decreasing absorption being fiber, phytic acid, and oxalic acid. As we saw on the other slide, that in terms of transport, most will be transported free as free calcium, and also bound to albumin. So we'll now discuss the functions and regulation of calcium. So typically we think of calcium as it relates to bone metabolism and bone health. However, calcium has other very important roles in the body, and those roles are dependent on maintaining adequate extracellular calcium levels, so adequate serum calcium levels. Normal serum calcium levels range between 8.5 to about 10 milligrams per deciliter, and it's important to keep serum calcium within that tight range to maintain adequate nerve conduction and muscle contraction particularly, and we're going to discuss calcium's role in nerve conduction and muscle contraction, but it's going to be essential that serum calcium levels are maintained within that range to allow for those important processes essential for life. So there are three key compounds involved in regulating serum calcium levels and maintaining calcium levels between the range of about 8.5 to 10 milligrams per deciliter. So we see here PTH, or parathyroid hormone. We see another hormone called calcitonin, which opposes PTH. And then also we see calcitriol, which we said before was active vitamin D. So PTH and calcitriol, the active vitamin D, will work together in actually increasing serum calcium levels if it dips below the low end of the range, so it dips below 8.5 milligrams per deciliter. Calcitonin opposes, again, PTH and calcitriol and becoming more active when serum calcium goes above approximately 10 milligrams per deciliter, so if calcium levels becomes too high. So we're going to see in more detail the effect of PTH, calcitriol, and calcitonin on serum calcium levels, also when we discuss vitamin D. But we're going to see primarily that these compounds have significant effects at the small intestine, and affects calcium absorption, has effects at the level of the bone, and also at the level of the kidney. And just kind of as a summary, since PTH and calcitriol are going to be more active when serum calcium is low, we want to think about what effect these compounds may have at the small intestine in terms of absorption of calcium, the bone, and the kidney. So we did mention previously, and it is fairly well understood, that at the level of the small intestine, active vitamin D increases calcium absorption. And it increases calcium absorption because we want to increase serum calcium levels. At the level of the bone, it actually increases with PTH what's called bone resorption or bone demineralization. So it actually promotes the demineralization of bone, freeing the calcium minerals within bone, allowing it to supply serum calcium and increase serum calcium levels. So at the level of the small intestine, it increases calcium absorption. At the level of the bone, it increases demineralization, freeing calcium from the bone so it can enter the blood. And in the kidney, so the kidney is responsible for filtering, excreting, or reabsorbing nutrients. So at the level of the kidney, it actually increases calcium reabsorption and decreases calcium excretion. We'll talk in more detail about how calcitriol plays the role at each of these sites. So here again we see the effects of PTH, calcitriol, and calcitonin on each of these components. So we see that as it relates to bone calcium, PTH and also calcitriol with PTH decreases bone calcium, so it promotes the demineralization of bone, decreasing bone calcium. Calcitonin does the opposite, so it takes calcium from the blood and deposits it in bone, increasing bone calcium. And then as it relates to renal calcium reabsorption, so PTH and calcitriol increases renal calcium reabsorption. Calcitonin promotes renal calcium excretion, so it decreases reabsorption. And then we see that PTH and calcitriol increase intestinal calcium absorption.